I would like to continue with our next presenter, and that is Dr. Franck Galtier from CIRAD. He's working there as an economist, and he's also focusing on agricultural markets in developing countries.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Franck Galtier. I'm an economist. I'm working in CIRAD, which is a French research institute specialized on tropical agricultures. And I'm working on agricultural markets in developing countries. And one of my main research topics is on managing food price instability. So my presentation will be, first I will begin to present the magnitude of price instability really quickly, then to give some elements on the consequences of this, then give a panorama of the different options to manage it, then a brief overview of the controversies around these potential solutions. Then I will present what is currently the dominant doctrine on doing this, the mainstream doctrine. And then I will try to question if this doctrine provides satisfying solutions or not. And I will try to do it by two ways. One is assessing the underlying assumption of this doctrine. And the second one is in the case of a specific example, and to check what are the proposals made by this, by the mainstream, and to see if they provide satisfying solutions or not. So very briefly, you can see on this graph international prices. Everybody knows it. Prices have increased a lot during the last years. Maybe more interesting, in developing countries, you can see that here is the consumption prices in Bamako, Mali. And you can see that the price of millet, sorghum, and maize, which are the grain consumed by the poorest in the country, sometimes increase a lot. In few months, it can go from 1 to 2.5. If now we consider producer prices in the same country, here is the case of millet, we can see that we have also very strong cases of price collapses. Okay, so you will tell me, okay, prices are unstable, so what? Here, we will try to check the consequences on consumers. What you can see in this table is that grain provides a very important part of the calories for all the social classes, people being urban, rural, rich or poor, and also that grain accounts for a very important part of food expenditure and even of total expenditures of households. So based on this, the consequences, we have basically three kinds of consequences of consumer. One, the most dramatic one, is consumers who have to reduce their grain consumption in the case of a price increase. And in this case, they may suffer from deficiencies in calories. The second consequences possible is households that in order to maintain their grain consumption level will reduce the consumption of other foods or will reduce their health expenditures. And in this case, the increase in the price of grain may affect food security by other ways. You will have deficiencies in nutriments and so on. And another very important thing is that it can reduce the savings, the capital, and the resilience of households. So I will come back to this later on. Now, if we check the consequences on farmers, if the price of grain is highly unstable, it's risky to invest. So farmers will be reluctant to invest, banks will be reluctant to lend them money, and the investment in grain production will be low, which is in fact the case in most developing countries. And the consequences of this is that the grain productivity remains low and highly dependent on natural hazards. So you have three final consequences. One is that this maintains high level of price stability. It's a kind of vicious cycle because the production remains highly sensitive to natural hazards. Of course, if the price of basic food is high, it has consequences on food security. And it can even hamper the overall economic development process of the countries. Because if a great part of the resources of a country is used to produce basic foods, a great part of the land, of the labor is used to produce basic foods, and also if a great share of households' income is used to buy basic foods, it's a serious obstacle to development. So now let's move to the solutions. In the previous work, we proposed to classify the solutions in 4 strategies. Depending on the goal, we can be to stabilize prices or to reduce the effect of price instability. And depending on the modality of action, which can be market-based or based on public intervention. So by crossing the 2 criteria, we have 4 strategies. And we can consider them one by one. The A strategies mean to, its aim is to stabilize prices by improving food markets. If we have better food markets, we have a better compensation between surpluses and deficit, compensation in space and time, and more stable prices. We can also stabilize prices through public intervention, either based on public stocks or trade policies. It's the C strategy. And if we want to reduce the effect of price stability, we can try to do it through market-based tools. It's the B strategy. So basically, it's hedging tools, kind of insurance tools which will provide you some kind of financial compensation if the price increase too high or decrease too much. And we can also reduce the effect of price stability through public intervention. In this case, it's basically targeted transfers, which can be emergency aid, safety nets, and so on. So we have many controversies around these solutions. If we regard market-based tools, what kind of policies can be implemented by governments to help these market-based tools? Basically, what governments can do is provide a regulatory framework, is to provide public goods, and in some cases, to provide subsidies. So, for instance, some experts recommend that the state should subsidize private storage. Some experts recommend that the state should subsidize insurance products. But, of course, it's highly controversial. Public good, it's much less controversial, but regulatory framework can also be highly controversial. For instance, in Ethiopia, the commodity exchange in Ethiopia, ICX, if you want to export coffee, you have to buy the coffee on the commodity exchange. It's mandatory. So in some cases, the regulatory framework can also lead to controversies. If we regard the D strategy, so targeted transfers, the main controversies are on the nature of the transfer, cash versus in-kind, if you need a strict or broad targeting, and also if the transfer should be activated only in period of crisis, so meaning emergency aid, or also if you need to have some kind of structural transfers provided through safety nets. And regarding the C strategies, maybe there that you have the strongest controversies. The controversies are, should the state intervene never, always, or only in certain conditions? For instance, only when it's obvious that the market failed because you have bubble, panics, and so on. Another question is, should the state intervene only for food staple, for instance, for grain, also for coffee, cocoa, and other commodities? Another is the scale. Should the state intervene to stabilize prices, domestic prices, internal prices, or also do we need some kind of international stabilization of prices? And also, do we need price stabilization only in developing countries or also in developed countries? And also, there are controversies on the tools to be used if we want to do this. So we have many controversies, but we have clearly a mainstream doctrine. And what is saying this doctrine is that we can go for market-based tools. We need to go very carefully with targeted transfers. And going carefully mean to have a strict targeting of this transfer and to activate them only in periods of emergency. And we should not use public stabilization policies. This is the mainstream doctrine. So my point in this presentation is to try to question if this doctrine provides satisfying solutions or not. And in order to do this, what I will proceed by 2 ways. One is to assess its underlying assumption, and the other one is to assess the relevance of its recommendation in the case of a very specific problem. So the first approach, basically, the first approach, basically, basically, the 3 steps of this approach, the first one is first to identify what are the underlying assumptions of the dominant doctrine. Secondly, to check to what extent these assumptions are satisfied in the real world, and third, to see what are the consequences if they are not. So I wrote a paper on this, and this paper will be printed, so you will have it this afternoon or tomorrow. You can have a hard copy of this. Yeah, I will try to give a very brief overview of this because we don't have lots of time. Some of the main assumptions of the mainstream doctrine is that full markets are assumed to be efficient to prevent price collapses. Because if there are surpluses, the price will decrease a little, and this decrease in the price will be enough to give an incentive to storers to buy a lot, to store a lot. So you cannot have price collapses according to the theory. The second point is that the negative correlation between prices and harvest is supposed to provide a negative, a kind of natural insurance. If the price decreases, it's because the harvest is good, so the farmer will lose on the price, but as he will win on the quantity, you will have a kind of compensation between the two types of risks. The three arguments, the three reasons, the three ways to protect farmers is that they are assumed to be able to hedge on future markets. And regarding consumers, it's assumed that emergency targeted aid is sufficient to protect them because it will provide transfer to food insecure households in periods of emergency, and it's assumed to be enough and to be not too costly because you have a strict targeting and you activate the transfers only in periods of emergency. I will go very quickly on the first approach. Do grain market impede price collapses? If we check graphs, we'll see that indeed we have price collapses. And the main reason for this is that the theory said that private storers will store a lot when the price decreases a little, but the assumption behind this is that storers are assumed to be risk neutral, so to store as much as if storing was not a risky activity, which is not the fact in the real world. We can see that maybe in some cases farmers can benefit from a natural insurance, but in many cases we don't have this correlation between the individual level of harvest and the level of prices. For instance, if you take the case of rice, there is no reason for a rice African farmers to have his own harvest being correlated with the level of the rice of price. The level of the price of rice depends on the level of production of Thailand and Vietnam. So this correlation doesn't always exist. And when it exists, which is the case for some commodities, we have to keep in mind that it plays against deficit farmers. So in developing countries, many farmers don't produce enough to feed their families, so they have to buy on the market. And in fact, many farmers are in this situation. In Ethiopia, until 73% of the farmers are net buyers. And for these farmers, when this negative correlation between harvest and price exists, this means that it's when the harvest is bad, they have to buy more on the market, and at this moment the price is high. So for them, it's not a protection, it's not a natural insurance. The two risks are going together. Regarding the ability of farmers and other stakeholders in developing countries to hedge against price risk on future markets, well, first, obviously, there are problems of access. These tools are costly, they are technical and difficult to use. They are suited for stakeholders dealing with great quantity, which is not the case of many of stakeholders in developing countries. But in addition to this, for many commodities, we don't have future markets. No future market for millet, sorghum, yams, cassava. Future market for rice are not working. And when we have future market, as is the case for maize, for instance, they do not provide an effective cover. If you want to check the reason for this, we have to check. On the graph, you can see the producer price of maize in Mali. And we can see the red circles show the situation of price collapses. And what we can see is that in each of these situations, the price didn't collapse on SAFEX, which is the nearest future market. Meaning that if maize farmers in Mali has been covered on SAFEX, when the price collapsed, the price they face, they would not have received a financial compensation from SAFEX because at this moment, the price in SAFEX didn't decrease. Go on. Okay, you have to put a bit up, up, up. Okay. So last point: are consumers effectively protected by emergency aid? What we learned during the 2005 crisis in Sahel countries is that the high frequency of price crises generate a decrease in households' capital. So from a price crisis to the next one, households lose their resilience. And the same thing has been observed in other parts of the world, especially in the Horn of Africa. And what this means, the practical implication of this, is that emergency aid is not effective to protect food insecure households. Why? Because some of them suffering from chronic malnutrition, and they receive the transfer only in period of crisis. And the second one is, as only food insecure households are covered, households who are poor, not food insecure for now, but poor, they will not be covered by the transfer. So they will have to dip into their saving and to lose their capital to pass the crisis, and it will not put a brake on household decapitalization. And the result for this is that the number of households to be helped, the number of households who need to receive transfer is increasing with time. And for instance, we have evidences that managing the 2010 crisis in Niger costed twice the cost of managing the 2005 crisis in the same country. So it's not a sustainable way to manage crisis. Now I'll try to give a second approach to question the mainstream doctrine, which is to take a specific problem and to see what this doctrine recommends and to check if it can work or not. So the specific problem is the case of the rice crisis in 2008. So this crisis has been analyzed as the bubble of export bans and panic imports. Because some countries banned their exports, India has been the first one, it generated an increase in the price, in the international price of rice, and it gives an incentive to the countries to ban their exports or to import a lot, panic imports. And giving this, they generated an additional increase in the prices, who in turn give an incentive to countries to ban their exports or to increase their imports. So we have a kind of bubble, and the chronology of this has been analyzed. And what Derek Hide showed is that it's almost half and half. So half of the problem was export bans, and half of the problem was panic imports. So we can analyze this vicious cycle like this. We have expectation of price increases, who leads country to ban their exports or to increase strongly their imports. And this generates an additional increase in prices, who in its turn feed the expectation of price increases. So in order to break this vicious cycle, the mainstream solutions proposed has been these two. One is to improve the information on stocks. It's the A strategy. So it assumes that even if prices increase, if you provide information on stocks to people, they will not expect that the price will continue to increase. And the second one is to modify WTO rules to forbid export bans. Currently, countries are free to ban their export if they want. In this case, it's assumed that even if countries expect price to increase, if they are not allowed to ban the exports, they will not do it, and it's a way to break the vicious cycle. Can these two proposals work or not? Well, the first one has been implemented. It's the AMIS mechanism implemented by the G20, endorsed at the FAO. We can question the feasibility and the relevance of this strategy. First, the feasibility. Is it possible to collect data on grain stocks? First, many governments don't know the level of private stocks in their own countries. In fact, the great majority of governments have no idea of the level of stocks in their own country. And in addition to this, many governments are also reluctant to communicate the data on public stocks. So it seems to be highly difficult to collect reliable data on grain stocks. But also we can question the relevance of this. Let's assume that we are able to collect reliable data on grain stocks. Will it be sufficient to solve the problem? In fact, we may think that if the level of stock is low, disseminating this information can even increase the problem. You know, if the level of stocks is very low and you increase the transparency, everybody will know that stocks are low, and in fact even generate panics. Now, if we check the second proposal, which is modify WTO rules in order to forbid export bans. So it has been proposed during the G20 process in 2011. And again, we can question the feasibility and the relevance of this strategy. Regarding the feasibility, what we have seen during the G20 process, that at the beginning it was a proposal. But many countries disagree with this and were against this. And at the end of the day, the G20 agreement was a very small thing compared to the initial proposal, which was to forbid countries to put bans on exports for WFP. And even this very small proposal has not been endorsed by the WTO. So we can see that the feasibility of changing WTO rules is not so obvious. And if we assume that WTO rules are modified, the enforcement of these rules will also be a problem, because especially in Asia, rice is a very important product for food security, and it's probable that governments would prefer not to respect WTO rules than to generate food insecurity and social instability in their own country. But also, maybe most important, we can question the relevance of this strategy. If we check what happened in 2008, China and India banned their exports, their grain exports, and thanks to these policies and additional policies, they succeeded in protecting their country from the increase of price in the international market. And we know that 43% of undernourished people in the world are living in these two countries. So these policies have been able to protect 43% of undernourished people in the world. So is it so obvious that forbidding export bans would be a good idea? I don't know, but at least the question is on the table. Okay, so we check the two kind of solutions proposed by the mainstream doctrine. Could we think to alternative solutions? The idea to modify WTO rules to forbid export ban, the initial idea was to break the relationship between the expectation that price will increase and export bans. But we may also try to intervene on panic imports. To say, even if importing countries are expecting the price will increase, to prevent them to increase a lot their imports. And in order to do this, we may maybe help them, or at least relax WTO rules in order to allow them to increase the level of their public stocks. So this proposal, you remember that the work of Derek Ede shows that 50% of the problem was with export bans and 50% with panic imports. So we can say that theoretically, at least on the paper, an increase in the level of grain stocks in importing countries would be a way to tackle 50% of the problem. Another alternative would be to build international public stocks to hold the price below a ceiling. So these are alternative solutions. Of course, these alternative solutions also may generate problems. I don't know if they would work or not. My point is that they should be studied. So the concluding remarks. The first, the solution recommended by the mainstream are not really satisfying for developing countries and for international market. My view is that for developed countries, they are working not so bad, maybe. So they're not really satisfying. So this should give us an incentive to look to alternative solutions and to study them carefully. I don't know if these alternative solutions would work or not, but at least we should study them. So we should go beyond the politically correct, break the taboo, and try to provide a critical assessment of alternative solutions. To go further, there is the article I already mentioned, a book. This book is available online for free. I have 3 or 4 hard copies of the book in my room, so I will bring it this afternoon and tomorrow. If you want to check it, or if you're interested, I can give you one. The reference cited. Thank you for your attention.
Well, Franck, thanks very much. There's again the opportunity to ask a few questions for clarification. Yes? Is there a microphone?
Thanks. Thank you. With Franck, we had the opportunity to discuss that internally when he came and made the presentation to DG Agri, but I will go a step further now, because I think in trying to identify what you call the mainstream doctrine, as if there is one, with a caricature you arrive at an outcome that tends to idealize reality. So I'm going to read you what is 2 weeks old from Reuters. Just a simple news. Thailand's government has sold a higher than targeted 730,000 tons of rice from state warehouses to exporters, likely incurring huge losses given the high price it paid under a controversial intervention scheme. The sales will put more downward pressure on market prices and not to add to the anger of farmers, many of whom have not been paid by the state for their grain for months. If you add to that the major benefits that competitors of Thailand got out of the scheme, you have a clear case definition of your strategy C, applied in practice, on top of the use of the extra pound, that has some concrete results. That being said, I'm not the one that would claim that the situation that markets are perfect, that they always work, but at least when we come to practical suggestions, we need to take account and adapt what we say on the basis of what is really happening. And here we have a very concrete case with concrete results, which were not the ones that initially were thought about.
Okay, so maybe regarding this, if we check example of price stabilization policies, we'll find failures and we'll find successes. So we'll find both in the history. Successes, for instance, the EU farmer cap, the policies in the USA, many policies in Asian countries for rice, for instance, in Indonesia, rice stabilization policies. And we'll find also many failures in Asian countries, in African countries. We'll find both. What we'll find also if we check historical experiences is that successful green revolution in the past have almost always been accompanied by floor price policies. It has been the case in Western Europe countries, in Northern American countries, and in many Asian countries. So we have failures, we have successes, and the successes have been associated, almost always green revolutions have been associated with floor price policies. For a very simple reason, which is that floor price policies are almost the only practical way we have to provide security to farmers, and by this way to give them an incentive to invest and to facilitate their access to credit. But also the other thing I wanted to say is that surely public intervention on markets can generate bad effects. And the one of Thailand you mentioned is one of them. But we have to balance these potentially bad effects with potentially good effects. And for instance, regarding public stocks, if we check WTO rules, current WTO rules are very hard with public stocks and unfair in a way, I would say. And the reason for this is that WTO rules has been produced in a context of surpluses. So the problem was to manage the surpluses. And private stocks were perceived as a way to increase production by buying at a high price to farmers. And then when you have productions and you release them on the market, you will depress the prices. So there was a very negative vision of public stocks. But times are changing, and now we know that deficits can also occur. So we have to balance the risk of public stocks depressing prices with the risk of lack of public stocks allowing price spikes. And my point of view is that we have to balance these two kinds of risks.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Well, there's a next question over here, and then there's another question over here. Alexander?
Franck, I think the whole point of your presentation is the last point, namely you need C type of measures, and in particular public stocks. Let us not forget that the only countries where this thing has worked is the Asian countries like Indonesia and some others, India, where the main objective was not stock policy, it was really to trying to keep prices at certain levels to benefit producers and consumers. It was done at huge cost, but they were willing to absorb the cost. Same thing with the US. The issue was not stock policies, was trying to keep prices high for produce. The issue was the same with the cap, and all of them cost a lot of money and they disappeared. You know, from the previous crisis, now 35 years ago when it was in 75, everybody was talking about international stocks. They had a lot of discussion, but it is so costly and it is so difficult to coordinate at international level, while you can do it at the national level if you have the money, that for very few commodities it was ever started, and for the commodities that it worked, like tin and others, it didn't work. And we know that. So I really think the idea of trying to reduce instability and basically reducing exposed instability is basically a non-starter. There is no way you can beat the market, because that's what you're talking about. And in fact, if you try to have public stocks, the private sector will react and will counteract pretty much anything that the public will do. And this has been shown time and again. So my point is, it might appear like an attractive idea, but it has never worked in practice, or where it worked, it's so expensive that no country or no international organization has the funds to do it. And besides that, let me say, you know, I started my career advocating stocks, but after 30 or so years, I've come to the idea that this is really a non-starter. And perhaps we miss the lessons of history.
Okay, but your question is?
Yes.
Thank you, Aleko. Well, in fact, I get two different questions or remarks. One is on it's very expensive to do this. So is it worth to do this due to the cost? And my point is that I previously said that the aim to do this, to guarantee floor prices to farmers, is to stimulate green revolutions. So you need this in countries where the productivity is low, especially the productivity of grain production is low, and where you succeeded in stimulated investment. You change the structure, the productive structure of the agriculture in these countries. Then the costs began to be much higher than the benefits, the cost of these policies. And the cap is a very good example of this. At the beginning, the cap has been a tool to stimulate the production in the EU, but then it began to generate surpluses, to generate pollution, to generate a very unfair distribution of aids, and so on. So my view is not to advocate for this for all countries and as a permanent tool. It's a tool to stimulate the transition, the transformation of agriculture to a more productive model. That's the reason why, in my view, this policy is adapted for developing countries with a low grain production, but then it should be phased out when the productivity has increased, and the policies should be changed. So the first point. The second point on international reserve. So it has been said that, oh, it's not possible to intervene on international market. It's too complicated. And we have experiences of this. We have experiences of this, especially for coffee, cocoa, natural rubber, and so on. And international agreement has been developed for this product, and they have been abandoned after a few decades of existence. And from this abandonment, some persons have concluded that it's not feasible and to stabilize grain prices. But if you check more carefully, what you can see is that the aim of these agreements was not to stabilize prices, but to support prices. It has been estimated, for instance, for coffee and cocoa, that the international price was twice the price it would have been without the agreement. And these schemes succeeded in maintaining the international price much above its normal market level during decades. So if we take as a much more simple objective, which is to stabilize the price around its mid-term trend level, not to support, just to stabilize. The difficulty is not the same. For instance, the cocoa agreements. Well, the reason for the end of the cocoa agreement was that in order to support the price of cocoa, the stocks was buying so much that it was very costly to have these mountains of cocoa. But the reason for this was because the agreement was trying to maintain the price of cocoa much above its market price. But stabilizing is something different, and in a way much more simple to do, or less difficult.
Let's have one more brief question, actually, and then we continue with the next presentation, and we can keep the questions for the other, for the final discussion. That's one more brief question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have actually two, but I will
make it one
briefly. Yeah. Actually, when you look to rural areas in developing countries like Mali or other countries, we are facing a very, very strange situation where we have an heterogeneous situation where you can have a producer who is a net buyer for staple food. So my first question is, when we are assessing those kind of, let's say, levels of price or volatility, we cannot put producers in the same basket, because some will gain when you have high level of prices, some will lose, like consumers in urban areas. So I think we have to be careful on this issue. My second point is, where, Franck, in your framework, where do you put enhancing production? Because last year I did an exercise using Garch and Garch models, modeling volatility in Mali, Niger, and Senegal. And one of my conclusion was that Mali, where we are at a level of sufficiency in rice production, is very good protected from world market transmission volatility in rice. While Senegal is facing a very, very quick transmission. So in my opinion, if we want a sustainable way to protect people or vulnerable households from volatility, is to enhance production, because we are so far on this aspect in Africa. Thank you.
Well, I fully agree with all your remarks. The point is that you have a kind of vicious cycle between the level of price stability and increasing production and productivity. So to break this vicious cycle, at what moment? Well, at least the lesson of history is that almost always when countries have strongly increased the productivity of grain production, it has been done thanks to floor price policies. Because this floor price gives the security which is necessary to boost investment. So production and price stability are very strongly related problem. And that's true that when you succeeded in stimulating investment, it will generate also effect on price stability. For instance, with more investment, you can have a production less sensitive to natural hazard and so on.
All right. Well, thank you very much.